If you can't focus after lunch anymore, the first assumption people make is mental fatigue. They think their brain is tired. They think maybe they've hit their limit, or maybe it's just part of getting older. Those assumptions are wrong. What you're experiencing is not a failure of motivation or discipline or age. It's a physiological shift that deprioritizes the brain. Focus is not a mindset. Focus is a state, and that state depends on circulation, chemistry, and nervous system signaling. When those shift, attention disappears, no matter how driven you are. And here's how I need you to look at the whole situation. Post-lunch focus loss is not your brain checking out. It is your body reallocating resources away from the brain. And there's a big difference there. After you eat, digestion becomes a top priority. Blood flow is redirected to the gut. Energy is shifted toward processing food. And the nervous system changes gears a little bit. In a resilient system, this shift is very subtle. In a stressed or overloaded system, it's fairly dramatic. The brain suddenly has less blood flow. It has less oxygen. It has less metabolic support. And the first thing to go is higher executive function. Not consciousness, not basic alertness, but high order focus. And that is why you can stay awake, but it gets difficult to think. So let's dismantle the most common explanation to this. People call this brain fog, and that is basically just vague and unhelpful. What's actually happening is that the brain is temporarily under-resourced. The body is doing that on purpose. Your physiology is making a prioritization decision. Digestion over cognition. Survival over strategy. And this becomes much more noticeable as you get older, not because your brain is declining, but because your margin is just smaller. Earlier in life, you could absorb those shifts without noticing. Now, you feel them. And this is also why caffeine feels like it should help, but often it doesn't. Caffeine stimulates the nervous system, but it does not fix circulation. It tells the brain to try harder without giving it more fuel. And sometimes that works. Often it just creates jittery, unfocused energy. Now, when we talk about dopamine, we need to include that because focus depends on it. After a meal, dopamine signaling naturally drops. That's normal. But in a system that's already taxed by stress, poor sleep, or blood sugar instability, that drop is exaggerated. So attention collapses. And this is why post-lunch focus loss feels different than general tiredness. You can still function. You just have a lot of trouble staying locked in. Your brain keeps looking for something easier. Email, scrolling, meetings, and it's not because you're bored. It's because sustained focus has become metabolically expensive. Now, if we layer in the nervous system, we need to look at high performers, and they spend most of their day in a sympathetic state, alert, driven, problem solving. That state is very powerful, but it's costly. And by early afternoon, neural fatigue sets in. Again, not sleepiness, it's fatigue. The circuits responsible for executive control are the first to feel it. So when digestion pulls resources away from the brain, those circuits drop offline. And that is the focus crash that you feel. Now, here's the most important thing to understand. None of this is random. It follows a very predictable pattern. You have high demand in the morning, digestion at midday, reduced brain resources, and focus failure. In that order, always. If you don't understand the pattern, it can feel like decline. If you do understand it, well, then it becomes fixable. Because the solution isn't more effort. It is restoring the conditions that allow the brain to stay prioritized after you eat, after lunch. So the real question isn't, why can't I focus anymore? The better question is this: why does my brain lose priority after lunch when it didn't used to? And that's what we need to dissect a little bit. Because once you see why the brain is being deprioritized, you can change the conditions that cause that deprioritization. And now that we've kind of changed how we're looking and how we view what's happening, let's get a little bit more specific, because post-lunch focus loss is not vague, it's mechanical. The very first system involved is circulation. After you eat, blood flow is intentionally redirected toward the digestive system. And that's not a flaw, that's just basic physiology. Digestion requires massive resources: blood, oxygen, energy. So the body makes a trade. It pulls circulation away from the brain and toward the gut. In a resilient system, that shift is barely noticeable. In a system that's already under load, that shift is very dramatic. The brain doesn't shut off, it just downshifts. And the first thing to go, like I mentioned, is executive function, strategic thinking, sustained attention, complex problem solving. And that's why you can stay awake easily, but it's difficult to think clearly. So now let's layer in insulin signaling. When you eat, insulin rises to manage the incoming glucose. Insulin doesn't just affect blood sugar, it also affects neurotransmitters. So after a meal, insulin drives certain amino acids into muscle tissue, changing the balance of chemicals that are available to the brain. That shift can reduce alertness and focus temporarily. Again, very normal in isolation. But when blood sugar regulation is inefficient, that effect is amplified. Glucose rises too quickly, blood sugar drops. The brain hates instability, so attention drops with it. Now, let's bring dopamine into the picture. Dopamine is what allows you to stay engaged with a task that hasn't paid off yet. After eating, dopamine signaling naturally declines, and that's very intentional. Your brain is shifting from seeking to processing. In a system with good margin, that's fine. In a system that's already stressed, that drop is very steep. So motivation collapses. Not drive, not ambition, just the ability to stay engaged. And this is why after lunch, even simple tasks feel heavier. And it's not that you don't want to work, it's just that your brain has temporarily deprioritized effort-heavy thinking. And now, on top of all that other stuff, let's layer in nervous system fatigue. High performers spend the entire morning burning through cognitive resources: decision-making, problem-solving, pressure. By midday, those circuits are fatigued. Not exhausted, but definitely less efficient. So when digestion pulls blood flow and dopamine drops, the system doesn't have enough reserve to compensate. So your focus fails. And here's where people misinterpret what's happening. They assume that they're tired. They assume they need more stimulation. So they reach for caffeine, coffee, Red Bulls, Monsters. But caffeine doesn't restore circulation. It doesn't fix insulin signaling, and it doesn't stabilize dopamine. It just tells the nervous system to push harder. And sometimes that works briefly. More often, it creates jittery, unfocused energy that feels worse than the fog itself. So let's add in one more layer that almost nobody talks about in this pattern: inflammation. Highly processed meals, food sensitivities, or chronic gut stress can trigger low-grade inflammatory responses after eating. That inflammation affects the brain very quickly. It alters neurotransmitter signaling, it increases perceived effort, it reduces cognitive clarity. And this doesn't feel like sickness or anything, it just feels like fog. And because the effect is delayed, people blame lunch in general instead of understanding the underlying response. But now step back and look at the full picture. Post-lunch focus loss is not one thing. It is a convergence of a few things. Blood flow shifts to digestion. Insulin alters brain chemistry. Dopamine drops, and the nervous system is already fatigued, plus inflammation may be present. That combination deprioritizes the brain, so focus disappears. Because your physiology made a rational decision. The mistake is thinking that this is just somehow inevitable. It's not. The pattern is predictable, which means it can be modified. So the real question becomes this: if your brain loses priority after lunch because resources are being pulled elsewhere, what would happen if you change the conditions that force that trade-off? That is where the solution lives. And that's what we'll close with next: a solution. Because now that you understand why focus disappears after lunch, the solution becomes much more grounded. It's not about forcing things. It's about changing the conditions that cause your brain to be deprioritized in the first place. The first lever is circulation. If digestion is going to pull blood flow toward the gut, you need to make sure the brain doesn't get left behind. That means breaking the pattern of sitting motionless after lunch. You don't need to exercise, you just need some movement. A short walk, standing, moving around. Light movement is all it really takes. This improves circulation and oxygen delivery without activating stress. It tells the body it can support digestion and cognition at the same time. That alone restores more focus than most people expect. The second lever is meal structure. Not dieting, not restriction, structure. Meals that hit the system all at once force a large insulin response. That makes the post-meal dip even worse. Meals that are balanced slow digestion and they smooth signaling. No processed crap, natural one-ingredient foods if possible, with protein as a priority, some healthy fats, and carbohydrates that don't arrive in a rush. The goal here is not to eliminate carbs. It is to prevent the brain from experiencing instability. Stability preserves attention. The third lever is nervous system load. Most high performers push hard throughout the entire morning. Meetings are stacked, decisions back to back, constant problem solving. And by lunch, the nervous system's already fatigued. So when digestion adds demand, there's no buffer. One of the very simplest fixes is spacing cognitive demand. Not doing your most mentally expensive work immediately after eating. If you insist on peak level thinking while your body is reallocating resources, you're going to lose every time. And that's not weakness, it's just basic biology. The fourth lever is dopamine management. After lunch, dopamine naturally dips. If your system is already overstimulated, that dip feels severe. Constant novelty, notifications, and stimulations earlier in the day exaggerate that drop. Reducing stimulation before lunch improves focus after lunch. And I know that may sound counterintuitive, but it works. Less dopamine spent early means more available later. And now let's look at caffeine in kind of an honest light. Caffeine can help, but only if the foundation is stable. If you use caffeine to override circulation issues, insulin swings, and nervous system fatigue, it's going to backfire. If you use caffeine on top of a stable system, it'll work wonders. The problem isn't caffeine, it's dependency. When caffeine becomes required for baseline focus, the system's already compromised. And the final lever here is inflammation. If certain meals consistently produce fog, heaviness, or mental drag, that is information that you need to pay attention to. Low-grade inflammation affects cognitive clarity very quickly. And this isn't about food rules or anything like that. It's about noticing patterns. When inflammation drops, focus improves. Now here's the most important mindset shift. Post-lunch focus is not a sign of decline. It's not age-related. It's a sign that your body is reallocating resources under load. And that is not permanent. And it's not random. When you restore circulation, stabilize signaling, and reduce unnecessary stress earlier in the day, the brain keeps its priority. Focus returns. And not because you forced it, because your system stopped working against you. So if you've been blaming yourself for losing focus after lunch, stop. It's not your fault. This isn't about motivation. It's about physiology. And physiology responds to the right conditions. If this clarified why focus disappears after lunch, even when energy seems fine, subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell. This channel exists to explain why high performers hit invisible performance walls and how to remove them at the systems level. And if you want deeper breakdowns on restoring focus, energy, and resilience, check the links in the description. Losing focus after lunch isn't inevitable. It's just feedback. And now you know how to respond to that feedback. I'll see you all very soon. Take care.